as Mike says, my name's Tom Selby. I'm a senior analyst at AJ Bell. I have to give an extra risk warning because not only do I work for a financial services company, but I used to be a journalist as well, so I really wouldn't believe anything that you're about to hear. So the things that we're going to talk about today, so the title of the presentation is How to Avoid Running Out of Money in Retirement. So I'm going to look at a few of the key principles that you need to think about. So the focus of the chat today is going to be around the end bit, so turning your defined contribution pot and any other pensions you've got into a retirement income. But before we go into that, I'm just going to quickly cover the first bit, so saving for retirement. The best and easiest way to make sure that your retirement lasts as long as you do is if you have a big enough pot in the first place. So I'm going to cover a few of the bits around there. A very quick look at investing for retirement and the importance of patience, especially when you're building up a retirement pot. And then finally, the last bit, as I said, turning your pension into an income that lasts throughout retirement. And I think there's obviously been a lot of changes in pensions. I know Ian covered a lot of those off earlier, but I think it's important to remember that while there is a lot of new flexibility and that's been talked about, the main purpose of a pension is to provide an income throughout your retirement. So the saving for retirement bit, I thought the best way to illustrate this was Black Friday. So this is, pensions tax relief is like Black Friday all year round. I don't mean that in a bad way, this looks horrific, but pension tax relief offers you a bonus on saving into a pension that's incredibly generous. So tax relief granted at your marginal rate of income tax, that's still the case. We've had another budget where there was a lot of rumour and speculation that tax relief was going to be a tax. That hasn't happened. So if you're a base rate taxpayer, you still get 20% relief. Higher rate taxpayer, 40%, and additional rate taxpayer, 45%. What does that mean in real life? Well, £10,000 in a pension. If you're a base rate taxpayer, it'll cost you £8,000. Higher rate taxpayer, it'll cost you £6,000. 45% taxpayer, it'll cost you just £5,500. It's a straightforward point, but it's important to make the most of this free stuff when you're building up a pension pot. As I said earlier, the easiest way to make sure you've got enough money in retirement at the end is either invest it in Bitcoin, no, I didn't say that, that's not allowed, or just make sure you build up a decent pot and make the most of the free money that's on offer. You may have seen some of the slightly cringeworthy adverts for automatic enrolment. So you pay in, your boss pays in too. So if you're employed, then your employer by April 20th, 2019 will have to match at least your first 3% of contributions into a workplace scheme. Again, it's one of these things that sounds quite boring, but effectively that's a 100% guaranteed return on your investment from your employer's matched contribution. That's just the minimum as well. So some employers will match up to 5%, 10%. Some employers will give you 2-for-1 matching on your contributions. So as you're building up a pot that's going to be decent and big enough to last you throughout retirement, there's all this free stuff on offer that everyone should take advantage of if they can afford to. As a result of all that free stuff, you've got restricted access. So there are a few things that the government puts in place to make sure that it doesn't cost it too much money in order to incentivise you to save. So as I mentioned, we had a budget. There was a lot of rumour and speculation that a lot of these allowances were going to change significantly. Luckily, for the purposes of this presentation anyway, that didn't happen. So we still have an annual allowance, so an annual cap on the tax incentivised amount you can save into a pension, set at £40,000. A slight change in the lifetime allowance, so that's just going to notch up in line with inflation, so by 3% by April 2018. A small change, but that's an extra £7,500 in tax-free cash that you could potentially have if you're lucky enough to have a pension pot of that size. The money purchase annual allowance. Now this, in the context of this chat, that's quite important because not my favourite by any means, but if you access any taxable income from your pension from age 55, then the annual allowance that you can take advantage of, I'll use this little pointer, that's quite nice, isn't it? So the annual allowance that you get falls from 40 grand down to 4 grand. Now, a lot of people, and maybe some of you here today, will be thinking about using the pension freedoms to access your pension pot in order to maybe pay for university education for your kids, to buy a house, to pay for repairs, perhaps to pay for care for an elderly relative. Now, there's nothing wrong with doing that, but you need to be aware of the fact that if you do that, then your annual allowance will go down from 40 grand to 4 grand. So your ability to build up a bigger pension pot again after doing that will be significantly reduced. And finally, unfortunately, I'm not going to have enough time to talk about the tapered annual allowance. It's one of the most complicated things in pensions. I suggest if you have to deal with that, then speak to a financial advisor. Essentially, if you've got total earnings worth over £150,000, then subject to certain conditions, your annual allowance may slowly taper down by £2 for every £1 of earned income you've got above that rate, potentially down to £10,000. So that's just the framework of allowances that you need to be aware of. Now, just a quick one on investing for retirement. Thank you to Russ Mould, our investment director, who helped me put these slides together. So in a broad perspective, the key to making the stock market work for you when you're investing for retirement is to invest in stocks that pay dividends and reinvest in those dividends when you get it so you can benefit from compound growth. I'm reliably informed Mark Cuban is an American billionaire who owns an NBA basketball team, so he's obviously done reasonably well for himself. I believe non-dividend stocks aren't much more than baseball cards. They're worth what you convince someone to pay for them. So the underlying value of the stock's worth what you can convince someone to pay for them, but the key is the dividends and the reinvestment of those dividends. Just to bring home that point, so clearly returns on cash up here have been very poor in recent years, looking at a time period of 5 to 30 years. Looking here at the return on the FTSE 100, so that's just the capital return, again, over that period of time. Decent returns, but it's when you look at the value of compound annual returns in the FTSE All-Share Total Return Index that you start to see the real value of investing in the stock market over the long term. Again, just to ram home this point, again, this is just a guide as to what the stock market could do over a long period of time. So we're looking at an MSCI World Tracker since 1970, initial value £10,000. Clearly, you've had inflation over that period of time, but worth £440,000 today. Now, if you're a retirement investor, clearly you should be able to ride out these things. So we've got the dot-com bubble there. It looks really like Bitcoin, actually, doesn't it? So we've got the dot-com bubble there. We've got the great market crash there. But if you're investing over a 20, 30, 40-year period of time, then you don't need to worry so much about these dips because you can think of it as a long trajectory up to there, obviously investing in a way that meets your time horizon and your own personal appetite to risk. Now, what connects these two wonderful gentlemen? Well, the answer, of course, is, I was going to shout this out, but I won't, freedom. Didn't think I'd have that quickly. So as a result of changes announced, I'm sure you know by this man, not this man, in April 2015, from the age of 55, you can take as much as you want from your pension pot. Now, that is subject to tax, so you can still have 25% tax-free, and the rest is taxed at your marginal rate. So that's clearly a very exciting change, adds a lot of flexibility. There's still 3 clear options in terms of turning that money into an income. So you can still pay an insurance company to give you a guaranteed income for life. You can go into drawdown and manage your own withdrawal risk and also keep your money invested. Or there's, and I apologise for that acronym, I didn't come up with it, it was HMRC. It's one of the worst things I think I've ever seen in my life. So you can take ad hoc lump sums. That stands for uncrystallised funds pension lump sums. That essentially means that you take money directly from the scheme and 25% of each withdrawal will be tax-free with the rest taxed at your marginal rate. As a result of those changes, we've seen a huge shift in the market. So Ian touched on this earlier, but I don't think, you can't emphasise enough how big a societal shift this is and how big a shift for the market's been as well. You've moved from a situation where essentially insurance companies and company-defined benefit pension schemes were looking after and taking on the risk of people living longer than they might think they would do. We've now seen a complete shift now, so that for every annuity that's sold, 2 people enter into drawdown contracts and manage that longevity risk themselves. That's an incredible shift. It's a big experiment, and we're going to start to find out exactly what the impacts that will be on society and on the individual investors as well. This wonderful woman celebrating her 117th birthday, I thought would be a good way to illustrate the point that your pension still needs to last throughout your retirement, a point that I made at the start, but I think is sometimes lost in the excitement of the pension freedoms. In terms of how you do that, so we're looking at drawdown now, so obviously an annuity, then you've secured your income, looking at drawdown and managing that yourself. Bill Bengen, a reasonably famous American financial planner, suggested, based on historical investment returns, that 4% would be a safe withdrawal rate if you're a 65-year-old, and that's adjusted for inflation each year. So when I say 4% withdrawal rate, what I mean is 4% of the principal amount that you have invested. So if you've got 100 grand, then you should, if the theory is true, be able to take out 4 grand a year, adjusted for inflation, and that money should last as long as you do. Now, I should add, there have been some challenges to that figure recently, and some people now suggest it's somewhere around 3%. But in terms of a guide as to what is sensible, then that's a good starting point. Now, in terms of how you take the money out, two options, natural income or total return. Now, in an ideal world, I think a natural income strategy would be ideal for most people. So just living off the dividends, living off the coupons from your underlying investments, and leaving the actual investment itself untouched. Unfortunately, it was touched upon earlier in Ian's presentation, certainly in the early years of retirement, a lot of people want to spend more money and they'll want to dig into that capital in order to fund their lifestyles. So natural income, ideal, but real world, a lot of people will be using their entire pot and selling investments in order to generate the income that they want from their retirement pot. So two different strategies here. Again, something that Ian touched on. So previously, the idea would have probably been to spend your entire pension pot and not leave anything behind. Because of changes to the rules that were also announced in April 2015, pensions are now a very tax-efficient IHT vehicle. So if you die before 75, you can pass on your money tax-free. If you die after 75, then it's taxed at your beneficiary's marginal rate. So some people want to spend a lot and leave nothing. Some people will be making these decisions thinking they want to leave something to the kids, to the wife, whatever. Okay, so that's the kind of theory and the backdrop behind retirement income. But we, AJ Bell, wanted to get a feel for how people were actually using the pension freedoms, see if there were any lessons that could be learned. So as you can see here, we surveyed 250 people who'd actually entered income drawdown. We got comrades to do it, so it's an independent piece of work. 44% of the people that we spoke to were taking withdrawals of 10% or more from their pots. So that was something that we saw and we thought potentially that's a little bit of a worry. If you think of Bengen's withdrawal rate of 4%, 10% clearly a lot higher than that. We really started to get worried when we saw that 57% of people in the 55 to 59 age bracket, so that's the lowest age bracket that we spoke to, were withdrawing more than 10% of their fund each year. But see, that starts to reduce as you get a little bit older, so 60, 64, 43%, 34% for 65 to 69. And so we asked ourselves, why exactly is this happening? And the conclusion that we drew was that people are playing a life expectancy guessing game and are getting it, in some cases, spectacularly wrong. I should caveat that by saying that some of those people won't be getting it wrong because they'll have other forms of secure income, defined benefit pensions, things like that. But some of that sample size will be getting it wrong. So over half of 55 to 59-year-olds expected their retirement pot would need to last less than 20 years. More worrying, almost a quarter thought it would need to last less than 10 years. Now, if you compare that to the ONS and average life expectancy, so 24 to 27 years for men, 26 to 30 years for women, clearly there's a discrepancy there. The other thing that you need to think about, of course, is this is just the average. So if people are getting it wrong just below the average, if you're devising a retirement income strategy, you'd hope that you're going to live beyond the average. You're going to live to 90, perhaps to 100 as well. And that income needs to last you for that entire time. So the idea that 20 years or even 10 years could be right is, it's not optimistic, it's pessimistic. And just to reinforce that point, 50,000 people aged just over 100 in 2016, almost doubled since 2002. And that's likely to keep increasing exponentially as life expectancies rise. Just to illustrate the point around the 10% withdrawal level, so we ran a very simple model, so looking at the average fund value of the sample size, assumed a flat investment growth throughout of 4% after charges. The 10% withdrawal runs out of money after just 12 years. Reduce that to 6%, and your money runs out after 26 years. So it looks like a slightly better picture under 6%, but I think most people, the idea of their money running out after 12 years would be quite scary. It gets even scarier if you start to think about the fact that your returns might not be flat. So if you have a series of bad returns in the early years of retirement, then you'll suffer from something that's called pound cost ravaging. So those early years of negative returns combined with big withdrawals mean that even if you get some good returns in later years, it's more difficult to make up that lost money. So just quickly to finish off with, a quick checklist of things that I think you need to think about as if you're accessing your pension flexibly. So first of all, be clear on how long your pension income needs to last for. So we saw from the slide a couple of slides ago, a lot of people are not being realistic about how long they're going to live for. The reality is you need to plan not just to live to 70, 80, 90, unless if you're in good health, then there's a good chance you're going to live to 100. So you need to build a strategy assuming that that's going to be the case. Deciding which product you're going to choose, so this is crucial. So if you're comfortable with the risk of staying invested in the stock market, then drawdown might be appropriate because it provides you with added flexibility. Equally, there's been a lot of talk of the death of the annuity market. The reality is annuities are still a good option for a lot of people if you don't want to take any investment risk. And the reality is for many people, it'll actually be a combination of those two things that will work. So perhaps a little bit of guaranteed income from an annuity and then a little bit of flexibility on top of that with drawdown. Something that's often forgotten in the debate, state pension entitlement. The state pension, certainly for future retirees and for a lot of previous retirees as well, can be incredibly valuable. If you think of the single-tier state pension, I think it's just over £160 a week for a 65-year-old. Inflation-linked, if you wanted to buy that from an insurance company, it cost about £250,000, something like that. So in terms of a baseline retirement income, the state pension is an important part of the mix. Have a clear investment strategy, so know your time horizon, know the kind of risks you want to take, think about the kind of returns you want to get, and then build a retirement strategy around those things. Realistic withdrawal levels, clearly this is very, very important. So obviously everybody's different, and the amount of money that people are going to take from their fund will depend on their own personal circumstances and things like that, but you need to be aware that if you're taking withdrawals of 10, 15, even 20%, some that we've seen, especially in the early years before 65, there's a pretty decent chance that your money is going to run out before you do. So you need to think about whether or not you're willing to live on any other income sources you've got, or simply rely on money from the state, or downsize, or whatever options might be available to you. This is something that we'd say to anybody. So always have a cash buffer available. Clearly, expenses can kick in at any point, and whether you're in your 20s or you're in your 70s, having some liquid cash available that you can use for a boiler breaking down, whatever is essential. And finally, and this is an absolutely critical point, review as regularly as possible. I think Ian mentioned once a year, I think, is a good benchmark in terms of reviewing your investment strategy, in reviewing your withdrawals, just to see if those two things are eating away at your portfolio. Review your platform, check your charges, all that kind of stuff. You need to be active and involved, especially if you're in drawdown, because nobody else is there to manage the risk. You've got to do it for yourself. And that's it. Thank you for listening to me ramble on for 18 minutes. If we don't have a stand, but if anyone has any questions for me, I'll kind of loiter around there. I'll be the person with the grey jumper on. Thank you very much.